Hello to anyone who may be watching this very different video that we're recording. Hi, Jack. How you going?
Hey, Nick.
Hey, Rich. How are you?
Hey, Nick. Well, thanks.
Guys, we're here today to talk about something a little bit different. Normally, we'd be recording an episode of Cybeers where we talk about general cybersecurity topics and we help to decipher some of the things that we see on an ongoing basis. Today, slightly different. We're talking about something that's in the media and our take on it. And that is the Optus breach. We won't go into comment on this. We'd had an internal discussion around if we were going to put something together. And we've had a lot of questions that have come from both our customers, general friends and family talking to me about this. And we thought we'd just put something short together to go through our experience, considering we work in digital forensics and incident response, our view of what has happened, and generally what people can do based on what is potentially Australia's largest breach to date of 9.8 million records. So really, this does serve just as some general information. There's going to be a lot of detail coming about from both Optus and, importantly, the ACSC over the coming days and weeks, and this will possibly drag out for months. So we'll continue to provide more information as it comes to light. But really wanted to hand over to you guys, especially Jack. I know you've got a lot of insight into this specific Optus breach. So really take us through what has happened. Why is this in the media? Why is it the top five things that we're seeing on almost all of the news sites, and why is it dominating the news cycle?
So, as you said, it's certainly Australia's largest data breach. So that's probably why it's at the top of the news cycle, I would say. So to go through a bit of a background of some of the details for those that might not have seen the information that's come out, Optus did send out a media notification last Thursday to acknowledge that they had been breached. Their data was being sold on the dark web. There's been a lot of subsequent conversation around that data being sold and the ways it's being sold. But essentially, it just constitutes quite a significant breach of people's information, Australians' information. And it's certainly the biggest that we've seen.
Yeah, 9.8 million records. And considering that Optus have 5.8 million approximate current customers, more and more light is coming, more and more information is coming to light. I find it quite interesting that there's approximately 9.8 million records that have been potentially compromised. So it seems that historic customers are also caught up in this, not just current customers.
I can confirm that is the case, being a previous Optus customer. I did receive the email from Optus telling me what information had been breached. And there is actually a good resource that people can use to find what information Optus might have on them. If you log into your Optus account, visit a specific URL, you can get this information back. The details are discussed on a Whirlpool thread at the moment. We'll send out after this talk.
Yeah, perfect. And I find it interesting. There's a lot of banners now on. I've seen Vic Road's website. They've put a banner up to direct people back to Optus. ANZ put something up yesterday, a banner to direct queries back to Optus. There seems to be a lot of questions and comments from the general public around the data that is being stored. I've just personally traveled around Europe for the last 4 weeks, been very lucky to do that, enjoy some time in summer. And I think the thing that I really appreciated was the cookie requirements, which come as part of GDPR in Europe. So begs the question, does Australia need something similar to GDPR? And are we actually going to see some privacy rights start to come into place?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, they're using that information obviously to verify someone's identity when they're signing up for a service, which is fair enough. Obviously, it's very difficult here in Australia to get, burner mobile numbers and things like that because of these requirements. But is there a need to necessarily hang on to that information after you've satisfied those requirements and store it for such a long period of time? Obviously, we've got, previous Optus customers caught up in it. Is there a need to retain that information? Is there a requirement for it, or is it sort of a difficult thing to go and extract that information and remove it after the fact? I think it's going to be a pretty interesting topic over the next few weeks as it unfolds further.
Should there be readily available tools to allow users to delete their information?
Yeah.
Right. Because there is in other countries around the world. I know we've got the draft bill, the critical infrastructure bill that has been approved in Parliament. It has scheduled to come into enforcement. It had been scheduled, and then the nasty COVID hit. So I think this is just going to accelerate critical infrastructure bill, and industries that typically haven't been regulated are going to start being regulated, and maybe we will see these requirements come in similar to GDPR.
Indeed, yes, it'll be interesting to see. So let's talk a little bit about how this might have occurred.
Yeah,
shall we?
How did it happen? That's the thing on everyone's minds is how did Australia's second largest telco, how did a compromise occur? And not just a small compromise. 9.8 million records is a lot, and I've read a lot of articles from different people to say it's a sophisticated breach. But take us through it, Jack. Take us through it, because I don't see it as a sophisticated breach myself, but that's because I'm in the industry.
Well, I mean, it's generally the case from what we've seen, right, where often the largest breaches are a case of easily exploitable vulnerabilities. It's generally the low-hanging fruit that people go for. And it's more rare to see sophisticated threat actors exploiting these and then trying to sell them for financial gain. So it's important to note that much of this is somewhat speculative. The information is coming from the threat actor themselves, being posted on dark web forums. I haven't actually seen this verified by a legitimate source such as Optus themselves. But speculation goes that they had an exposed API endpoint publicly accessible that was used to retrieve the information of customers. The primary key for this retrieval of information was the customer ID itself, which was an integer that was enumerable. So in our line of business, we know this as an insecure direct object reference or an IDOR vulnerability, in which an attacker can take advantage of one of these endpoints that doesn't have appropriate authentication or authorization behind it. They can essentially make many requests, one after the other, incrementing this customer ID to retrieve the information of the users associated with the customer ID. It shows a lack of authorization controls. Obviously, the threat actor should not have been authorized to access this information, but it also shows somewhat insecure architecture because that customer ID would ideally be a value that couldn't be enumerated, such as a GUID, for example.
And from what I've read, this was in a test environment, not in production. So I
saw bits and pieces about that too. The jury's still out, I think. Not sure.
Yeah. So how does an organization like Optus have this IDOR vulnerability? And it just goes with the question of a company that's worth billions of dollars. How did they have it, let alone how does a company that doesn't have such a security team as Optus protect themselves against a similar vulnerability and a similar breach?
It's a good question, right? And it could have been one of several reasons. Again, just speculating. But often, if this vulnerability hasn't been found, they may very well be performing penetration testing. I'm sure they are. I'm sure there's many regulatory requirements for penetration testing. But if the right assets aren't in scope for a penetration test, then we may not find the vulnerabilities, right? Subsequently, if the tester doesn't have the right amount of experience, it could be missed. And also, it could have just been a recent change that hasn't been pen tested yet. As a result, generally organizations will perform penetration tests annually. This change was only made in the last few weeks, few months. It just hasn't been looked at yet. Could be many reasons. But these are all the reasons that many organizations struggle with to monitor their external attack surface and to make sure they're mitigating potential compromises.
Yeah, and I think you've just hit on a very important note there. All three of us were at Black Hat and DEF CON a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of talk around attack surface management. We'd mentioned in a previous video that there wasn't that one key topic that I had personally seen around Black Hat and DEF CON, but there was a lot of talk about attack surface management. There was about 4 or 5 booths that I thought that I saw. Is that going to now come to the forefront? Is that now going to be the thing that becomes really important? Is ASM, or is this potentially something they knew existed? And as you say, there was no pen testing, or perhaps the developer or speculatively, a developer who implemented a change didn't have the appropriate training. What do you see as really the key controls that an organization can take to protect themselves, not just pen testing, which needs to be part of the security strategy, part of the quiver, but it's not the only answer.
Yeah, I think attack surface management is absolutely a huge one. I mean, Rich, how many DFIR incidents did we have this year that if they were monitoring their external attack surface to identify, for example, a vulnerable exchange server, then the compromises could have been easily mitigated or cut off at the first step?
I mean, heaps. Not just, exchange servers that, may have been forgotten by the organization and someone, just hasn't patched them for whatever reason, but someone's enabled port forwarding for a remote desktop server, and just they set it up so that someone could remote in and forgot about it, and a threat actor gets in that way. So yeah, definitely knowing what in your environment is externally facing is a massive thing the organization should be very well aware of.
Yeah,
and organizations are identifying this.
Yeah,
for example, it's only been something new that's come up in the last probably 12 to 24 months. There's been a lot of talk about attack surface management, and I don't think a lot of organizations have even started to consider it yet.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a big topic recently for penetration testing accreditation organizations. Let's look at Crest, for example. They've recently released what they're calling the Crest Approved Penetration Testing Framework. And the point of this is not to tell people how to do the technical ins and outs of a penetration test. The point of this is to make sure that everyone along the chain, from sales to scoping to execution to reporting to closeout, has the appropriate training to make sure that things like this happen correctly. And a huge one is scope. You can have the best penetration tester in the world looking at an external asset, but if you've scoped the test incorrectly and the right assets aren't there, and you're not monitoring the right assets externally, then it doesn't matter.
No, absolutely. And Rich, I know you've been keeping a fairly close eye on the dumps and all the dark websites. I believe it was around 10,200 records that were dropped this morning before they were then subsequently deleted, and another post was released to say that they felt bad because there was too many people looking at it. But there's a lot of copies that have been downloaded and now circulating.
Yeah, and on the website where it was originally posted, like there has been another thread created that basically just links to the previous sample files. So there were two documents that had 100 records in it each, and then that 10,000 record one from today. So they're still available to download. And yeah, as you mentioned, the same poster that originally posted the data has released another post on there saying, it's a bit too much attention. We've deleted the files. We're not going to sell it and things like that. So yeah, it's interesting to see what comes of that, whether they're sort of, they felt a bit of pressure because of the amount of attention this is getting, obviously from the Australian government as well. Australian Federal Police are involved, obviously. So perhaps, they sort of wanted to wash their hands of it and try and take a bit of pressure off.
Yeah, because they were asking for $1 million as well to not sell the data. So really, this is what we normally see during an investigation, that a sample file will be published to prove you've actually got the data to validate the threat. So my question is, do we think this is state-sponsored? Do we think it's an experienced threat actor group? Or is it someone who maybe just got lucky and didn't know what they'd stumbled onto? Which the post being subsequently deleted and feeling a bit of remorse suggests that it's not a threat actor group we would normally see, because they deal with this kind of pressure all the time. Colonial Pipeline, for instance, they held out for that for months. So do we think it's someone who might have just accidentally gotten lucky and now they're sitting back going, well, actually a little bit too much heat here for me?
Yes, I do think that you don't often see Russian state-sponsored groups take the foot off the throat once they have the ransom out there, do you? I do believe this would be an individual for whom the heat has become a little bit too much. Again, just speculation, but I don't think in any of our other engagements we've seen a threat actor retract the ransom at any point.
No, that's pretty much the aim of the game, is to elicit that payment. And they'll do what they can to get it. So it would be very abnormal for one of those big ransomware groups and other sort of threat actors at that level to go public and then, pull it all back. So yeah, I agree. It's more than likely sort of someone a bit less experienced, and maybe just a bit too much for them.
There's been talk as well that it was a sophisticated group because the IP address was continually changing. I've found that part quite interesting. That's how it's been tied to a sophisticated group. That's standard for what we see. And the finger has been pointed to Europe just because there was activity from an IP address coming out of Europe. What do you guys make of that?
Yeah. Yes, it certainly doesn't sound like an indicator that would point towards the group being particularly sophisticated. There's lots of tools out there that allow you to rotate IPs quite quickly. Usually for attacks of this nature, brute force attacks that require lots of enumeration to prevent third-party tools from blocking IP addresses, essentially. Do you agree, Rich?
Yeah, I would expect that perhaps the sophisticated attack part might have been worded by some PR people to try and sort of spin it that way. But I mean, I doubt we'll get to see the end incident response report. But from the sounds of what you're saying, I mean, you could just be using VPNs coming out of Europe to enumerate the endpoint, and that's not particularly sophisticated, I don't think.
So a question for you, Nick. I'm interested to know, how do you think Optus handled this data breach and their public relations as a result? Always a tricky area to navigate for any company, I'm sure.
Look, it is a very difficult thing for any organization to navigate. I'd never want to be in this scenario myself, and I'm sure that the CEO of Optus didn't sign up for this, but I think there's several ways to manage a crisis. I'm not particularly a fan of putting it out to the media first, and Optus have intentionally said they put it out to the media. They're the ones who put it out there because it was the fastest and easiest way to let people know. I think it's created a fair bit of hysteria, and public panic that obviously is warranted. I think there was probably a better way to handle it. In all fairness, the team, the crisis response team within Optus, they're probably up 22, 23 hours a day. They'll be fielding multiple phone calls. You don't plan for this level of a breach. You do an incident response plan and you test that on a regular basis. I doubt that going out to the media and telling them they've lost 9.8 million records would have been part of the crisis plan or the incident response plan. But you need to account for every scenario. This is obviously worst case scenario for them. Personally, I don't like the way it's been handled. I also don't like that they are providing Equifax monitoring only to customers that they've identified to say that you are most at risk. How have they determined the customers that are most at risk? Are they able to go through and see the data that they hold? I've been an Optus customer for 17 years. So fortunately, a lot of my personal data has probably expired and copies of what they had have expired. So I probably won't get Equifax monitoring as opposed to someone who they go through and work out and say, okay, we have your Medicare number, we have your passport number. If they're going to do it for some, they should do it for all. So I think there'll probably be a lot of changes that will occur as this incident progresses.
Indeed, and it will be interesting to see. Because like you say, I mean, I'm a previous customer, but the data that is still in there is valid for myself. Do I get monitoring? I'm not sure. Do they care about previous customers as much as they care about current customers? Dangerous question, perhaps.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see.
I think there'll be a lot of changes, and there's also going to be changes to cybersecurity legislation in general. We mentioned GDPR previously, and the critical infrastructure bill. I think it's going to be industries outside of those areas as well are going to start to reconsider their cybersecurity posture. Australia doesn't have the greatest cybersecurity posture from some of the presentations we went to at Black Hat and DEF CON. I think we all came to realise that we are fairly well lacking. Perhaps this will for some of the unregulated organizations and industries to actually understand that cybersecurity is important and you need to have relevant controls in place.
Indeed.
So in saying that, what can organizations do? What should they be doing? Or can they actually do anything off the back of this? Or is it up to the individuals to conduct their own monitoring and checking of credit scores? I know talking to some of our banking customers, they are doing a lot of fraud monitoring in the background. But what can our customers or anyone who's watching this, what can they do?
Yeah, very good question. So it's important to note that banks and financial institutions, for them, this is no new problem. Obviously, a lot of them do have quite sophisticated measures in place to protect against fraud as much as it is an ongoing battle. Individuals themselves, however, can protect themselves in many ways. I mean, personally, I know my data has been compromised many times before this. So I think it's important.
We won't talk about your former university.
This won't be the last time. This won't be the last time. It wasn't the first time, won't be the last time. So it's important to always think about the ways you should protect yourself online. Firstly, you need to monitor for suspicious activity in any of your accounts, suspicious logins. Multi-factor authentication is a huge layer of protection that should be implemented where you can, particularly on things that handle financial information. From an organizational level, companies can look at ways that they can detect and potentially show customers when other people might be logging into their accounts from maybe IP addresses that could be overseas, for example. But given that the release of this information would most likely result in threat actors trying to perform fraud, then training should also be given for help desk staff, for example, to assist them in mitigating against these fraud attacks, identifying when someone might be trying to call up and masquerade as someone else. That's an important layer of protection. Rich, any further insight into layers of protection?
And testing those controls as well. We've talked repeatedly about red teaming and conducting these kinds of simulated attack now to say, okay, well, someone calls the help desk, etc., with this legitimate identity. Are there any other challenges that you need to do? As you say, it's going to have a wide-ranging impact. Rich, any input there?
Yeah, I think if your service providers or banks have that additional challenge option, that's probably something that's worthwhile investigating, so that if someone does ring up and they have all your details so they can validate an ID check, there is that additional layer where there's a unique password or something, or unique numbers that they have to provide to verify that they are actually speaking to the real person. I think that'll be a good step to, if all this data does end up coming out, protecting people as best they can. On the personal level as well, just for individuals that may be affected, password management is something key as well. So there's heaps of tools out there, Bitwarden, 1Password, LastPass, things like that, which allow you to essentially have one strong master password, and then you got a vault in there where you can store passwords as well for other services and sites. And essentially you can make them have very strong random passwords that you don't need to remember because they're all stored within that password manager. So that's a good step to prevent using the same password on multiple services. And in the event that one of them gets compromised and the passwords are leaked, you're protected on that front.
Yeah, I think the really key for individuals is unfortunately going to be one of the credit monitoring services.
Yeah.
We've worked closely previously with ID Care, so that's an option. There's plenty of them out there. Obviously, Optus is talking about the Equifax service. So really, I do hope that they're going to go out to all customers and provide that. It's not a cheap solution by any means. I saw a report this morning that it's $15 per month per person. So I understand why Optus is trying to limit that just to the significantly impacted. But I genuinely do hope it's going to go out to everyone because, as we know, a lot of services, all you need is name, address, phone number, and you can get access. So I really do hope that it goes out to everyone.
Yeah. And one of the things to note as well is that in Victoria, I believe it's the same in some of the other states as well, is that you can't actually change some of those details like your driver's license prior to fraud occurring. Even if you can prove that it's been released, you have to wait for fraud to occur.
Interestingly enough, New South Wales have come out this morning and said they are going to assist people to change their driver's license numbers, and potentially others are going to follow. This then raises a whole other issue around, do we move to digital identities, and a whole another can of worms that we could talk about for hours. So really, in summary, we're suggesting organizations conduct ongoing attack surface management, regular penetration testing. Jack, would this have been picked up through something as ongoing vulnerability scanning, or is there any other ongoing monitoring that you can implement? Because sure, you can have attack surface management, but if you're not doing pen testing on it, which as we know is expensive and can be a bit cost prohibitive, is there any ongoing monitoring tools companies can implement, or does it come down to just pen testing?
Look, assuming that this breach occurred for the reasons that we spoke about earlier, which was an exposed API with a lack of authentication, then I think there's several missing layers of protection here that should be discussed and that companies should think about. The first one is attack surface management. Like you mentioned, Nick, to identify that this is exposed in the first place, to identify that it can be hit by attackers. The second one is obviously at the application level, where for the API itself, there's potential architecture insecurities, such as the use of incremental integers instead of GUIDs, the lack of authentication and authorization, but also the fact that an enormous brute force attack was not picked up by some kind of monitoring tool. If you have a service such as Cloudflare, for example, that could sit in front of this, it's more than likely to pick up such an attack and prevent the millions of enumerations that occurred. Subsequently as well, if you have a security operations center that might be monitoring logs of this nature internally, then it could very well be picked up by internal analysts at any time of the day and be escalated for action. So I think there's a few points here, as well as penetration testing, of course, upon the API in the end. So there's a few points here that I think it's broken down, but all those layers of security are vital, and it really goes to show the importance of defense in depth, right? You need lots of layers of security to protect your organization, your assets, your external perimeter, because if one layer fails, then there are others in place to protect that particular asset. And if any of those layers were in place here, I would expect the attack would be thwarted.
Yeah, gotcha. So conduct attack surface management, review that against your WAF, such as Cloudflare. If you identify an asset that's not sitting behind Cloudflare that you've discovered with attack surface management, put it behind the WAF. And then make sure you've got monitoring of all of those assets that you've discovered with attack surface management. I think that sums it up and wraps it up pretty well.
Great.
All right, guys, I know we're going to have a lot more to talk about on this topic. We've already spent almost half an hour. So if you've already stuck with us through that discussion, thank you very much. We'll be continuing to update and provide any more information as it comes to light. As always, if there's anything you'd like to discuss specifically, feel free to reach out to anyone at the TL team. Always happy to chat. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you provided the information that you need, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks all. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.